Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening's very exciting debate and discussion on Brexit. It's an issue that's been on all our minds this past week. I'm Emily Jones. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Government, the Blavatnik School of Government. I will chair the discussion and also share some of my own thoughts on trade negotiations, since that's what I work on. And as you know, exactly a week ago, the UK voted on a pretty simple question. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? And we all know the result. Almost 52% of voters, 17.4 million people voted to leave. 48%, 16 million people voted to remain. As you know, in Oxford, 70% voted for remain. And the interesting thing, of course, was that hardly anyone expected the result. 7 out of 10 voters who were polled at the exit polls expected a victory for the Remain campaign, including a majority of those who voted for Leave. And as I think we've seen this week, not even the Leave leaders of the Leave campaign expected them to win. We've seen very dramatic events unfold. The Prime Minister's resigned, both our main political parties are in turmoil, and we've seen strong reactions in the financial markets. There's absolutely no doubt this is a really important moment for the UK, and I think the wider world. I was with a group of African central bank governors just the last 2 days, and one of them said he thought this was the most important moment for globalization that we've had in the last 30 years. And the ramifications clearly go much beyond our own country. So Brexit has thrown up some really important questions about our identity as a country, our political system, our national security, and our economic relations with Europe and the rest of the world. And I think, from my perspective, certainly a striking thing is our leaders don't appear to have much of a game plan. So tonight we're here to discuss some of these big questions and to start to think through what options are available to us as a country. And we have a formidable panel of speakers whom I will introduce in a moment. A quick word about the format. We want to keep this very much a discussion with you. So what we'd like to do is we'll each speak for 5 minutes, and I'll be quite strict on the timing. And then we'll have an hour for question and answers. So please do sort of prep your answers as you listen. So we'll finish up at 7:30. We are on camera, so just to let you know, we're being recorded and we're live streaming. So when it comes to the questions and answers, we'll have microphones circulating. And just also to say that our speakers are speaking in their personal capacity this evening. So let me introduce our speakers. Professor Anne Davies, who's a professor of law and public policy and currently Dean of Law at the University of Oxford. Next to her is Dr. Tom Simpson, who's my colleague here in the Blavatnik School of Government, who's an associate professor of philosophy and public policy. Then Sir Lawrence Freedman, who's emeritus professor of war studies at King's College London and a visiting professor here at the school. And Lord Wood of Anfield, who's shadow minister, who was Labour Shadow Minister from 2011 to 2015 and is a Fellow of Practice here with us. So I think we agreed on the order. Stuart, you're going to kick us off with 5 minutes of reflection on the politics of all of this and how we got to where we are.
Yeah, I mean, 5 minutes. I don't know how I'm going to pad out 5 minutes. There's nothing to say. Thanks, Emily. Just a few remarks. I'm not going to cover everything, but whoever said that politics makes no difference to the world has been proved wrong in the last 6 days. So we've had the departure of a Prime Minister and the departure of the nemesis of the Prime Minister. We've got a Labour Party in, I would say, existential crisis. We've got UK PLC, or some chunks of it, revisiting what their plans are, and foreign companies too. We've got the settlement with Scotland is not so settled anymore, and we've got all sorts of other uncertainties thrown in the pot. I want to do two things. One is look at how we got here and then say what the five of the questions that our politics faces now. I mean, what happened on Thursday might, to many people, seem like a sort of collective two fingers up to the establishment in some broad way. But I think it's important not, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. But I don't think we should mistake the sort of visceralness of it for an outcome which was sort of casually brought about. I mean, the roots of what happened on Thursday, I think, go back a long, long way. And I just want to throw at you some of the ingredients that I think led to a small majority of people voting for Leave on Thursday. First, you've got a Tory party that has been split, I would say, since roughly 1846, between its economic liberalism and its nationalism. And the Tory party has periodically revisited this tension, from the Corn Laws to imperial preference to the first round of entry in the EEC to the 1990s sort of self-immolation of the Conservatives to now. You've got a Labour Party that, under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who I work for, made a historic achievement, which is reconciling the Labour Party with capitalism, whether you think that's correct or not. I think that's what they did. But in the course of it, I think they also generated a party that was much too sanguine about globalization, much too sanguine about the effects of it, and recommended a sort of too much of a sort of blithe response on the part of politicians to the problems that globalization threw up. You've got, I think, branching out from that, both on the right and the left, a consensus about the immutability of globalization, about the unchallengeability of a lot of the things that globalization brought in its wake. We've had a steady deindustrialization of large parts of our country, to which the political class's response has been a mixture of on your bike from one part of the audience to, well, that's just the way the modern world works, to, I'm sorry, but we couldn't possibly intervene to change course on this because it would violate the rules about letting the market economy work on its own. To, on the left, I think, sometimes responding with good intent by creating what has effectively been a dependency culture, a revolving door between bad work and no work with public support for that. All these responses, I think, have not been up to the task of meeting that challenge for a number of years. A collective failure of all politicians also to spot the fact that living standards for the majority of families have not been keeping up with aggregate growth for a long, long time, since the early 2000s, and not taking that challenge seriously. And that sort of implicit contract that as long as your family sees itself getting better off over time, that can justify a lot of other things going wrong. But when that breaks down, I think then a lot of what is legitimate in politics gets questioned. A collective failure, I think, to grapple with regional inequalities and take those seriously, and the dominance of London problem. A crash which not only had its own devastating effects on the country, but a response to the crash which has prioritized restoring the financial system first and made the price of that a price paid by all of us over a long, protracted period of time, without any political legitimacy attached to that, without a kind of narrative about why that's the right response. And on both parties' part also, not using the crash, I think, to revisit some of the fundamentals about the injustices and problems, productivity problems of the way our economy works. And lastly, two other things, if that's not enough, two other things. One is a narrative on Europe that both parties, to be fair, have perpetuated, which has basically taken lumps out of Europe for the sake of popular opinion at home, serially. Picked fights with Europe, portrayed Europe as the sort of the enemy, or not, sometimes the enemy's too strong, but the opponent that needs to be overcome. And it's very difficult then to pick up a narrative of praising Europe and trumpeting its virtues when you've been doing that not just for a while, but not just for a few years, but for a number of decades. And lastly, on immigration, I think both parties have embraced a growth model that relies on immigration, but never really bothered to build a political consensus for that immigration that economic commitment implied. So for all those reasons, I think, all those are just some of the ingredients that I think are behind what happened on Thursday. So where are we now? I mean, there's paradoxes galore in all this, right? There's the fact that Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, has spent his life opposing the European Union. And when a majority of the public agree with him, it could be the event that brings him down. That's one paradox. There's another paradox which has happened today, which is that Boris Johnson, if anyone is most associated with the Leave campaign, it's Boris, and he's lost the crown that he thought was going to follow from that. Because I think partly because the Conservative Party is now looking to a one-nation Tory narrative for the future, and the man who won the Leave campaign thereby showed that he was not the man who could unify the country because he divided the country to win. I mean, there's paradoxes all over the place here. Just 5 quick points. One is the Tories are in much better shape than they deserve to be, in my view, coming out of this referendum, and Labour is in much worse shape than you might have thought a few weeks ago. And the Tory side, I mean, for all the chaos of today, there is something like an orderly transition going on behind the chaos. I suspect that the camps around the candidates won't divide strictly on Leave, Remain lines. I think they'll be quite important to the leaders that they don't do that. I think there'll be a one nation, a veneer at least of one nation philosophy around all the candidates. And I think Cameron has done something very, very smart. He's resigned, in case you hadn't spotted, he's resigned And he's thereby said to the Leave campaign, okay, you take the reins now, or even if it's not a lever, the Leave philosophy now takes the reins of the next Conservative government. And he's done that, I think, because he thinks he doesn't want Britain to leave the European Union, and I think he thinks that Leave has to be seen to fail by taking the reins itself. I think that's what's going on here. I think Cameron thinks this is a right-wing takeover of his party that's gone on. He thinks that it's not good for the country, and the only way to respond to it is essentially to hand the reins over, confident that they will not be able to navigate their way through the pledges they've made. A second issue, how much I've got? I've finished my 5 minutes.
Pretty much.
All right. Let me just do two very quickly. Dilemmas. Do Remainers continue the fight, or do they make their peace with the referendum and either fight by other means or move on? That's a big issue. It's a massive issue for my party. There are a lot of people in the Labour Party who want to make the next election a kind of plebiscite about Europe. And I think there's an interesting question, particularly given the demographics of Labour support and the problem of Labour heartland support on this issue. It's a really big issue. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn, by the way, was brought down by Europe, but I think the prospect of an early election and the prospect of leaving the EU has precipitated a lot of what you've seen in Labour in the last few days. Is free movement negotiable with the British public, or can free movement be compromised? That, for me, is a huge issue that the next Conservative leader of our country has to face. And partly the answer to that, I think, will be how much buyer's remorse kicks in over the next few months, how much space politicians think is there to revisit the trade-off between the economics and the free movement issue. And lastly, there's this question which both parties have to face, which is, I think of both mainstream parties as essentially coalitions of the losers and winners of globalization. And what the Leave campaign brought out was the losers of globalization in both parties, or the opponents of it, sort of uniting forces. There is a massive job to do to rebuild those ties between the winners and losers of globalization. In my party, that means some pretty tough choices about some fundamental redistribution, in my view, between the haves and have-nots. And in the Conservative Party, it means some fundamental choices about how much they're prepared to compromise economic liberalism, because you can't do it unless you're prepared to have a stronger state intervention. And that's the dilemma, I think, for both parties. Different kind of dilemma addressing the same kind of issue. I'll stop there.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Stuart. Anne, we'll turn to you next, and I know you've kindly agreed to outline the legal aspect of this. I also know that you know a huge amount of about employment and social rights in Europe. So although you won't touch on that now, if anyone's got questions on that, I think Anne will be happy to field them afterwards. So
Thank
Anne,
you.
over to
So let me start by outlining a couple of ground rules for what I'm going to talk about. With this level of division in society and in our political parties, I think it's time for conciliatory strategies rather than for extremes. And that leads me to two conclusions. I don't think it's helpful to start arguing immediately for another referendum, although it's been said quite a lot that the result of a referendum is not legally binding, and that's absolutely true. Further action needs to be taken by Parliament or by the government to give effect to the referendum result. It's clearly politically inappropriate and undesirable to ignore that result. I think one of the major factors influencing people's views is a distrust of political elites, and simply calling for another referendum right away seems to me to be an obvious way of making that problem very substantially worse. I think it's also not helpful to argue, as some people have been doing, that we should just start ignoring EU law right away. In the UK constitutional framework, it would be perfectly possible to do this. We could just repeal the European Communities Act 1972, which is what gives effect to EU law in the UK's legal system. This would, of course, cause the UK to breach its treaty obligations in EU law, and I think it would give rise to lasting damage to the UK's standing as a country that shows respect for the rule of law on the international stage. So taking these 2 points together, what I think we need to be focusing on now is the process for an orderly exit, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. Let me start by giving you just a quick outline of Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. This is the article that has to be invoked in order for a member state to exit the European Union. And the first paragraph provides any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. And the member state begins by notifying the European Council of its intentions under Article 50, paragraph 2. The Council sets guidelines for the negotiation and appoints the lead negotiator. And then a withdrawal agreement is negotiated, which sets out the arrangements for withdrawal, taking account of the framework of the country's future relationship with the Union. I think it's worth pausing at that point to note that the withdrawal agreement doesn't have to be the end of the story in terms of the UK's future relationship with the EU. It would be perfectly possible to continue negotiating on other issues over a longer period of time. The withdrawal agreement has to be approved by the Council through qualified majority voting, minus the votes of the UK, obviously, and by the European Parliament by a simple majority. It's been pointed out that qualified majority voting under that formulation means in practice that France and Germany are quite close to having the ability to block any agreement that they don't like. They'd only need one other big player to vote with them in order to achieve that result. And of course, that leaves the UK in a relatively weak negotiating position. The UK is probably in quite a weak negotiating position anyway. From the date of entry into force of the withdrawal agreement, the UK would cease to be subject to the EU treaties. The important point, though, about the operation of Article 50 is this. If no agreement can be reached, the treaties cease to apply to the UK 2 years after the date of the notification. So the options we face are Brexit with an agreement, with a withdrawal agreement that we negotiate, or Brexit by default 2 years after the notification under Article 50. The 2-year deadline can be extended, but that requires unanimity in the Council, which means that any one of the other member states would be able to block that extension of the deadline. So one of the consequences that this all has politically is that once that clock starts ticking, we are heading towards the exit unless something remarkable happens. And so the date at which that formal notification is given and Article 50 is triggered becomes very important. And what happens before that date, whether any informal negotiations take place. Interestingly, the text of Article 50 doesn't contemplate a change of mind on the part of the withdrawing state. And it doesn't provide a mechanism for that. But of course, the withdrawal doesn't actually happen until the 2 years elapses or an agreement is reached. So I think as a matter of practical politics, we could say that it would be open to the other member states and the withdrawing member state to put a stop to the withdrawal process if everyone had changed their minds, because this would obviously be much easier than allowing the withdrawal to take place and then negotiating accession all over again. But of course, there's no obligation on the other member states to agree to this, and it's not clear what the legal mechanism would be for stopping the Article 50 clock. The ticking Article 50 clock also has an interesting consequence for another issue, which is whether it would be feasible to put any deal that was reached to the UK electorate in a second referendum at a much later stage. And again, that raises the issue about the Article 50 clock ticking. It assumes that we could reverse the effect of Article 50, change our minds if we decided that's what we wanted to do. And of course, I think there's a legitimacy question there. If you ask people to vote on whether they want to leave the EU without telling them what the terms are going to be, and a majority votes to leave nonetheless, then that might suggest that what people have voted for is leaving at all costs. Now, so far I've focused on the EU dimension. I just want to say something now about the UK dimension, because when we are thinking about our country's relationship with an international organisation, we have to look at it from both perspectives, what EU law says about it and what domestic constitutional law says about it. So how does the notification process under Article 50 actually work? What is required? And of course, it turns out that we don't know the answer to that at all. It's supposed to take place in accordance with UK constitutional arrangements, and those are notoriously not terribly clear and open to discussion. There is one school of thought that says that we've already done the notification, in the sense that the referendum has happened and the Prime Minister has indicated that he intends to be bound by the outcome, and he's gone to a European summit and said that. So you could take the view that since there are no formalities attaching to the notification, that's enough in itself. Luckily, nobody seems to be acting as if that's the case. And so something more formal is required. And there are two options here. One is that we could regard this as an act of the executive under its prerogative power to conduct foreign affairs. That would be the normal process that people would expect to happen. I suppose then the Prime Minister would send a letter on Downing Street headed notepaper saying this is a formal notification of our intent to invoke Article 50. But there's been quite an interesting debate in the legal blogosphere in the past few days about whether that is in fact sufficient. So my colleague Nick Barber and some colleagues from UCL have been arguing that it's actually a matter for Parliament, that we need an act of Parliament in order to trigger that notification. And their argument is that Article 50, once triggered, will almost certainly result in the UK leaving the EU, which would render the European Communities Act 1972 useless. And that would then mean that the Prime Minister, in making a notification, would be using a prerogative power to override a statute, which is not permitted as a matter of domestic constitutional law, where statute always takes primacy over the prerogative. I think that's a really interesting argument. I think you can see a court buying it, but equally you can see the argument going the other way, that what actually renders the 1972 Act useless is the UK's ultimate withdrawal from the EU and not the notification under Article 50. And of course, to give effect to the withdrawal, we really would need legislation, because otherwise the 1972 Act is left hanging and we don't know what the consequences of that would be, and our legal situation is left very unclear. One final point, because I know I'm running out of time. In terms of our exit strategy in legal terms, I think one of the most important things would be to start thinking now about legislation which will preserve the legal position until such time as we can calmly and reflectively review the various bits of law that we have that are derived from European sources. There's going to be quite a lot of that makes perfect sense that we're going to want to keep. Just plucking an example out of the air, the Equality Act would be a good example. We're not going to want to get rid of that, even though it is in some respects European inspired. So making sure that we preserve legislation and take our time about deciding what we still need in the future, I think will be hugely important. And the sooner we can start to get on with thinking about those things, the better. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Anne. I'm going to say a few words about the trade scenarios that we now face, and having sort of with the Article 50 trigger in the back of my mind. So as we all know, the UK needs to negotiate a new set of trading arrangements with the EU, but also with our other major trading partners, because the EU has free trade agreements with 53 markets. So again, if we come out, we would need to have new arrangements with those 53 markets. Obviously, the most pressing question is what we do with our trade arrangements with Europe. Technically, there are quite a few options. Politically, I think the scope is much narrower. Reading about them in the papers, the three options are really the Norway model. So joining the single market and staying as part of the single market, which is the least economically disruptive of all the options on the table. But of course, as we've heard from the Commission and others, in return for keeping full access to the single market, it's highly unlikely, I think, that we can negotiate very substantial concessions on migration and the free movement of people. So I think that's going to be the issue there. In addition, of course, we'd have to make similar level of contributions to the EU as we do now. And for those who voted leave, that's a pretty unpalatable solution. So I think the big question with that solution is, would it be politically palatable back at home? The second option on the table for us is to negotiate our own free trade agreement. So one option is to sort of, like Canada, the EU's just finished negotiations with Canada. Switzerland has a pretty complicated series of 120, I believe, bilateral deals with Europe that allow degrees of access. I mean, there, everything's up for grabs. It's not clear. There's no sort of off-the-shelf template. We'd need to negotiate section by section for the economy. The third big option then is to fall back on WTO rules. Here, of course, we'd have a situation where Europe would treat imports from the UK the same as it does for any other major trading partner, for example, the US. So the US, we don't have a free trade agreement at the moment, so we would be treated the same. The issue there is that I think there are costs for both sides, and I think we need to remember that. So it would be pretty economically disruptive. It wouldn't be a disaster, but I think German car manufacturers, for example, would lose out just as much as our own car manufacturers. So then to the politics of the negotiation, would the UK have the upper hand? I think we saw some claims to that before. I think it's fairly clearly an asymmetric negotiation. The EU, of course, is the world's largest economy. The UK economy is about a fifth of the size of Europe's economy. And although we would be, by some calculations, the EU's largest export market, similar in size to the US, Europe for us is a more important export market than we are for them. So for the UK trade, 45% of our exports go to Europe, and I think the calculation is something in the range of EU exports would be about 16% of EU exports would come to the UK. So the odds would be stacked against us. I don't think that means that we would necessarily get a bad deal, but it does mean that we need a very astute negotiating strategy. And just a couple of comments on that. 4 things I think are pretty important. One is having a highly competent and expert team, and here we struggle. The last trade negotiation we had was with Europe in 1973 when we acceded. So we haven't negotiated a trade deal since then. We've got a good few people in the European Commission who are UK nationals who know what they're doing, but precious few in Whitehall. So actually there's quite a big human resource crunch. And trade deals are fiendishly complicated. The Canada deal runs to 1,600 pages. So there is a serious problem about resourcing that. Perhaps more importantly, we need to know what we want and the trade-offs we're prepared to make. So at the moment, we've seen a sort of wish list in the media about all the things we'd like to have. But I think the more important question is, how do we prioritize that wish list? And what are we prepared to give up in return? So is it financial services, but not migration? These are some of the discussions that we now need to be having back home. And my fear here is that it's the loudest voices that we're seeing. The financial services sector has got its act together. They're lobbying hard, so is the car manufacturers. But I think it needs to be a national discussion. And for that, we need the small businesses around the table. We need the trade unions and others. The third thing is we need strong political leadership. Anyone who's studied negotiations, the best possible negotiating person or team you face across the negotiating table is a divided one, right? And when we're negotiating with Europe, they will capitalize on any division they can find. And we're not in a pretty place at the moment as a country in terms of having any sense of unity. And that will be exploited. So we need to get our act together. And then again, we need a strategy. So negotiations are much as an art as science, so we need the experts. But I think we really need to think through the politics of this. So to work out who our allies are within Europe and outside, to anticipate what Europe's going to ask of us, and be able to write their victory speech. This is often what we say in trade negotiations, or in negotiations in general. You need to be able to think what the other party wants, and they need to come away as victorious as us in this. So really getting into the minds of Merkel and others so to understand and respond accordingly. Trade negotiations can be fiendishly complicated. We wouldn't get a bespoke free trade deal done in 2 years. We might get the off-the-shelf Norway option done in 2 years because it's much more straightforward. But I think we've got to think quite carefully about triggering Article 50 in terms of the time frame. But for me, just the main point for me now is I think that this big discussion we need is an internal one. It's figuring out what we want going forward, the economic strategy that will deliver, and the trade deal that we want to see. And I don't think we've got our own house in order on that. So that's what I'd like to see. Tom, over to you. You've kindly agreed to talk through migration, democracy, some of the really big, tough nuts on tough and controversial issues on this. Thank you.
So I took a sip of water because I feel like a curious specimen wheeled out of an authentic lever, not only in Oxford, which has voted heavily for Remain, but also among academia, which shows very high degrees of conformity of opinion. If I can put it gently. Now, I just have 2 points that I'm going to try and make. And really, they speak to the two dilemmas that Stuart raised, which I think are no dilemmas whatsoever, even if you think they may be. So the first point is this: the result of the referendum must be respected. And you'll have seen various proposals over the last few days of ways that it could not be respected. So a second referendum, a la Ireland, the people haven't got it right, so we're going to keep on asking them until they get it right. Or David Lammy's tweet, MP, from a few days ago, our sovereign parliament needs now to vote. The referendum was advisory and non-binding. Or various legal options subjecting any acts of parliament to judicial review. And I just want to appeal to you in a really open-minded spirit. My guess is I'm speaking in the minority here. If any of those options appeal to you, please think again. And to see that, just imagine the reverse. So imagine a situation where the poor of the country have solidly voted for Remain. The elites, Westminster, academics, journalists, economists, the big banks, all think it should be Leave, and they stitch up the results. Can you see the fracture that has for the democratic future of the country? Deep loss of faith. So fundamental to democracy is the possibility that you kick out the people who are in power, who are making policy decisions which run counter to the will of the people. And so that's my really open plea to you. And I think behind it, there's been we've had a very civil discussion so far, and I'm really glad about that, and I very much hope, for my sake, that we remain in that spirit. But all of you know, if you've been following the internet, that is not the language that a lot of the discourse has been conducted in. And another paradox, so just a website called Open Democracy, which is a leading blog for roughly left liberal progressive tendencies. Recent article contains the following quote: "I'm convinced that the UK is a petty-minded island nation with fascist tendencies." And more closer to home, so there's a blog run by a lot of the people in Oxford involved in what's called practical ethics, thinking about the ethical considerations of real life, very much what I'm involved in. The latest post there has the title, "If you're a Conservative, you're not my friend." Now, that is not language which is calculated to heal. And I really appeal that there has to be a serious consideration of the mandate, the consequences of this referendum, and an acceptance of that going forward. So that's my first point. Here's my second point. Could I just ask for the slide to come up, please? So this is from Lord Ashcroft's polling company. It's just data about, well, you can see the questionnaire that was asked. So looking at what the different factors were that led people to vote in different directions. So please can you rank the following in order of how important they were in your decision. And for the UK overall, if you look on the right-hand side, why Leave voters voted Leave. The first is roughly a claim about democratic self-determination, the principle that decisions about the UK should be taken in the UK. And then secondly, voting to Leave offers the best chance for the UK to regain control over immigration and its own borders. So the first thing to note is that the dominant reason is one about national sovereignty. Stuart's shaking his head, maybe we'll have a discussion. And nonetheless, within that is our concerns about immigration. So let me just say a bit about the policy red lines that I think come out from this. So if we're to give effect to respecting the referendum, what does this look like in practice? I won't say very much about national sovereignty, because that's a question of legal frameworks. The question of human rights will be one of the touchstones of that, and there's a lot of hysteria on that particular discussion, which I just want to try and lance. So it's perfectly possible to be opposed to the European Convention of Human Rights, and it's being adjudged, it's being justiciable at the European Court of Human Rights, whilst also believing that human rights, those basic fundamental freedoms and dignities, should be respected. And human rights were protected, they were privileged, they were honoured, indeed in this country very well,
for many, many years before we ever signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights. So there's a more general question as to whether you trust, there's a very deep question about the nature of democracy here, whether you should have a written constitution in which you trust small numbers of unelected judges to preserve those freedoms, or whether you trust the representatives of the people elected in Parliament to do so. And I say it should be the latter. And in particular, the tendency towards activist judges who use the opportunity to make controversial rulings to interpret the law as they see fit, rather than in the spirit of the law, is particular evidence for that. I'm sure we'll return to that discussion. And I'd like to conclude on immigration. So one of the most damaging charges against the Leave campaign has been the claim that if you're concerned about immigration, you're a closet racist. And that allegation has been made very strongly over the last few days. And there's lots of reasons why immigration should matter, which are nothing to do with race. And let me give 4 of those reasons. So the first is access to public services. NHS, social housing, education. And many of us sitting here, let me put it anecdotally. When I came to Oxford, I sat down in the common room at college, and the first conversation that people had was, where are you going to live? And they said, well, you should live here, here, and here, because these are the best schools. Okay? I had the choice. Well, not so much in Oxford. I had to live outside Oxford because of the cost of housing. But I'm in an economic bracket which has that choice. If you're in the economic bracket that does not have that choice, and your child is going to a school where 60% of their peers don't speak English, and your child's education is suffering because of that, I think you may rightly question whether the distribution of burdens and of benefits is respecting your membership of the political community. Here's the first one. Second one is wage depreciation. So the economic model in general relies on immigration, but we don't hear very much data about the distribution of that. And if you're a builder in South Shields in Newcastle and your going rate is £3 an hour because Polish builders have come in and they can work at that rate because for them that's a good wage, but for you that's not a living wage, I say you have reasons for consideration. Thirdly, cultural identity. So there's a lot of scorn poured on this notion. If you really believe in diversity, if you really think that it's valuable that when you go to a different community it has a different character, there needs to be a settledness about that community. And I say that the same is true for the different communities within the UK. So I grew up in Scotland. The Highlands and Islands have a policy, or they certainly used to, I don't know if they still do, of restricting second home ownership in the Highlands and Islands because they wanted to preserve the cultural character of the islands. And I think that's a totally legitimate concern. So if you think that, for instance, indigenous nations around the world, First Nations, Aboriginal peoples, if they can legitimately mourn the loss of their culture, that is a concern that applies universally. It's not just a privilege of indigenous peoples there, it's a privilege that all nationalities hold. And fourthly, and I'll just be very quick, I think actually the survival of democracy depends on it. So I don't want to, I'm not about to say World War III breaks out. For democracy to work, you have to have a sense of shared identity, a shared allegiance, to be able to say, even though we have fundamentally different political visions of how society works, I trust you to care for my welfare ultimately. And Cameron and Corbyn clearly represent very different aspects of British culture and society. But I have the confidence that if push came to shove, they would be able to stand together and say, it's really obvious that the good of the UK requires this and we will work together for that. And what mass immigration does is it questions whether that contract has occurred, whether that contract still exists, rather. Because without that national identity, there's a serious question, and particularly for people coming from cultures where democracy has less of a root, whether indeed those that fundamental contract is still in play. So what's the policy red line here? I mean, it seems to me that we cannot, whilst respecting the result of the referendum, also accept freedom of movement within the EU. And there'll have to be some kind of points-based system which we go on to. So I look forward to robust discussion in due course.
And thank you, Tom. I think it's very important that we reach a crowd and have a genuine discussion and a measured discussion and then seek to understand those who've not always voted the same as us. So thank you very much for those interventions. Lawrence, over to you for your 5 minutes, and then we'll open up to the floor.
So this has been inevitably a discussion about what it means for us and how we do it. I just want to remind you that there's 27 other countries in all of this who are at the moment thinking about what it means for them, and that's relevant to the negotiation. My speciality is security, and it's important to understand that the EU, as we have it at the moment, is a response to two big security issues. The first was the aftermath of the Second World War, when it was the visionaries that created and the common market, became the common market, were aware that France and Germany, over the previous 100 years, had fought 3 times, and the idea was that only if they could integrate and come together, then that could be avoided. Now, this happened under a security framework set by the United States, which had nothing to do with what became the European Union, but it was an important component of what became known as the Long Peace. Secondly, it was response to events in 1989-90 and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Warsaw Pact. One of the great achievements of the European Union, which Britain actually played a leading role in, was to draw in those countries that had previously been communist and give them a model based on liberal capitalism and the rule of law as an alternative. And this has been stunningly successful. You only have to compare the growth of Poland compared with Ukraine over the last 25 years to see what a staggering difference this makes, and look at the corruption in Ukraine that was allowed to develop over this period, to see the importance of very high standards for being allowed to join both the EU and NATO. Now, it's not clear, it's not evident that these standards will always be sustained. There's some challenges that are important. Now, part and parcel of that was the immigration that we're now talking about. So what, in one sense, became a great boon for stability in Europe, also destabilized, ironically in some ways, the country that promoted it most. That's point one. So our security as a continent has been very beneficially influenced, I'd say, by the European Union, and that continues without us. The second part of that is the role that the EU has been able to play in the major crises on either side around the borders. One is the current Ukraine crisis, where the EU has helped to provide a negotiating framework, and the sanctions on Russia, which has, I think, helped to encourage Putin at least to try to find some sort of negotiating outcome, and has provided a lot of boost to Ukraine in terms of the helping it through the necessary reforms if it is going to reconstruct. Again, nothing that one wants to say is going to succeed at the moment, but at least as potential. And secondly, the crucial role that the EU played with in the negotiations which led to the Iranian deal at a time when the United States didn't want to talk to Iran, the EU did. Now, I don't see any particular reason why the UK can't be involved in those sorts of initiatives in the future, but it's important to keep in mind that the EU dimension was very important to them. So the sort of defence and security role that got caricatured during the debate, I mean, the easiest concession we can now make, if we want to go back to the Leave camp, is you heard all that talk about the European army. It isn't going to happen, because it was never going to happen in the way that it was discussed, because not only us, but most countries in the EU have no intention of allowing their national armed forces to be lost under some European flag. All we were ever talking about was quite useful cooperation on minor issues, on serious issues like piracy and so on, but was never going to substitute for the NATO role. Now, it's important to keep this in mind because there are some big challenges coming up, and I think this relates to how the negotiations are going to be continued in the future. The political context changes in this country daily. Sort of Hilary Mantel versus game theory at the moment is sort of court politics against a big strategic gambles about when do we invoke Article 50. The politics is changing daily. By September, October, it's going to look very different again in this country. Nobody's mentioned Scotland yet. Scotland is part of the negotiations. Scotland is sitting there at the table with Ireland, with Wales. It's going to be an important part of the calculation. But it's changing in Europe too. There are two big crises facing Europe. Ironically, we've got opt-outs of them both. One is the Eurozone and one is Schengen. Both of them are under enormous strain at the moment. The Eurozone is perfectly capable of having a major crisis over the next few weeks because of Italian banks alone. It's just as one in Brexit, and the financial fallout may already have made that more rather than less likely. So there's potential of major convulsions in Europe coming up, and that is going to affect the way that this issue is eventually resolved. So while I agree entirely with the view that it would be completely wrong, especially at the moment, to be scrabbling around for some way to reverse the decision that was taken last week, it doesn't seem to me to be wholly improper at all to think about a situation that could be developing on our continent over the next few months and how things might look in October. Potentially very difficult for all parties concerned. And so, let me conclude on the challenge that we face, where the game theory, it seems to me, comes in. The problem we've got, as Anne has very clearly pointed out, is that once you invoke Article 50, you've pulled the trigger. And once you've pulled the trigger, it's probably directed mainly at your foot. Our negotiating position is hopeless. It's very poor indeed. There's lots of talk about how easy it is to get trade negotiations. It's very easy to get a deal in a trade negotiation if you concede everything, or if you don't have any bargaining card. So no British government, and Theresa May, I think, made this clear today, is going to want to go into a negotiation with no... the only bargaining card we've got is whether or not we invoke Article 50. It's the only bargaining card we've got left. So I think that we have to try to imagine, given the rumbustious events of the last few days, it's hard to think 2 days ahead, never mind 2 or 3 months ahead, of a very different Europe and a very different UK, having to confront the real choices that were not confronted during the referendum campaign. That is, the choice between the single market and freedom of movement, the choice between further economic pain, which will affect many of these people who are currently angry and frustrated by globalization, but they're not going to be the ones who are going to escape. They're going to be the ones that are hurting most, versus trying to find a different way of addressing the freedom of migration issue, which is undoubtedly a large issue. So my view, which is somebody should put it on the table, is it may never happen. I just think it's something that could lead to a sort of Cold War of nobody quite being prepared to move to that next stage because they never quite have the confidence that it's going to produce an outcome that they can actually then sell with comfort to the British people. Because the ones, when the pain is being felt, it's not going to necessarily be blamed on the result of the referendum. It's still going to be blamed on the government of the day. So it's to put it, not to say it's likely that all of this will end with us still in the EU. It may not, but it's at least a possibility. It's what I call the Hotel California option. You can check out any time you want, but you can never leave. Okay.
On that note, thank you very much to all the panelists. So I've let them all run over. I've let everybody run over, but I thought the quality of all the contributions was such that it really merited it. So thanks to you all. Can we open up for discussion now? I'm going to take 4 questions at a time, keep them succinct, and then we'll try and whip through and we'll turn to the speakers. Yeah, gentleman here, gentleman there, and then I'm going to come this side, lady at the back. Anyone else on this side? And a lady here. Right. So, sorry, yeah.
My question is really...
Is it Mike, yeah. Sorry, because we were on camera, we need the mic.
I must have covered about 500 houses in Oxford in the Stronger In campaign, and so I had many discussions with Leavers, among others, and I realized that the lies which came on the Leaver side, like the 350 million, like Turkey, did stick. And I still ask myself, was this a genuine expression of the people's will, or were they misled into something?
Great, nice and succinct question, thank you. Yeah, gentleman behind you.
My question is addressed to Thomas, and I'm sure that you're quite right about the language and rhetoric coming out of the Remain camp is quite vile. But you suffer from the same deafness that some of the Leave campaign do, is that you obviously don't hear the same rhetoric and the same vile language that came out of Leave.uk with Nigel Farage, and you haven't obviously seen some of the trolling on websites that came out of the Leave campaign. It is you have to accept that your side has some very disgusting language as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask us all to keep the tone as not make this personal and to keep this as objective and factual as possible. But I think it's a very important point that you're raising, which is about both sides and the tone. And I think probably what's been quite an extreme language, we've seen it from some factions, but let's stand back from making generalizations, because this is fraught territory. There are really big questions and they're important ones. But I think the evidence, point very well taken. Okay, we're going to we'll take your question. There was another lady at the back.
Yes, quick question to Lord Wood. You seem to assume that existing parties would stay intact. I wondered if you'd like to kind of give us your sense of, which parties you might think are under existential threat and how we might get a fragmentation and a reconfiguration of parties. And quickly to Lawrence, I think you're so right about security threats. We haven't talked at all either about climate change, which for me, as somebody who works on environmental issues, is an existential threat at a global level, and where the European Union has been remarkably strong and progressive. I fear that a lot of that impetus will be lost, and that an awful lot of Brexiteers are also closet climate change deniers. I'd love to think that wasn't true, but I think it is.
Okay, and the lady at the back, one last question, and we'll come back to the panel.
It's more like a comment, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on the comment that was made before on the children in the school, in the classroom, speaking all the different languages, which I do not agree with. To me, it reminded me of a cartoon I saw on Facebook the other day, which kind of said elitist neoliberal capitalism is when the elite manages to convince the middle class that it's the immigrants and the poor people who steal all the money whilst the elite takes away all the money. And so I wholeheartedly, especially coming from Germany, where we have an excellent school system, I'm utterly shocked by the school system in this country, where all poor kids are separated from the good schools and don't have any chance to get the same education. And to me, I believe the Leave campaign managed really well to convince that it's the poor people and the immigrants who are the problem, while I believe it's the really strong elite in this country. Again, coming from Germany and coming here and seeing that the same boys who go to the same school in this country that meet in parliament are the same boys who run this country and then at the same time, like at the moment, destroy it. That's utterly shocking. So hence why I was a bit shocked by the comment and wanted to comment on this.
Great, thank you very much. So 4 really important issues there. Tom, do you want to kick off? I think you've got 2 in your department there at least.
Thank you. So if I can just come back to the gentleman's comment. Absolutely, there's mud on both slides, and it's a real sadness. And clearly the personal, political complexities of Westminster in some sense set the tone, and lots of people were using the debate for their own very nasty agenda. Absolutely take the point. And in some sense, we've all got a responsibility to try and move beyond that. You know, the challenge now is relational healing, and also the deep-seated identification. So I'm really excited, not because my side won, but because I think this is a deep opportunity for the country to rethink some quite fundamental questions.
Can I just pick up on that?
Yeah.
There was one question from the gentleman here, which was to say, do you think people were misled so that they had the wrong facts, so they didn't make an informed decision? So I think that's quite a lot of people's feeling. But where do you stand on that? Because that's obviously another.
Right. So yeah. So there's. I mean, I hesitate to use the word lies because in some sense that's to commit exactly the mudslinging that's been going on. But the 350 million statistic was not a helpful statistic. I don't know what the actual figure is. Well, it's so. I'll spill Clinton on the meaning of a lie. Like, it's economical with the truth, and I would.
It's a lie.
I think we can all agree that on both sides it's been hard to navigate for anybody. The facts actually on the table on both sides would be my sense of this.
Yeah. Right. So.
It was a non-fact.
Go on, Stuart.
But Stuart, yeah, come on in.
I'm a strong Remainer, so I disagree with Tom on the issue. But I don't think that the appearance of lies, mistakes, whatever you want to call it, I think it was a lie as well, right? But that happens in all general election campaigns. I was with Ed Miliband the last general election campaign. We got very annoyed at some of the things that were said. We thought they were fundamental misrepresentations. I'm sure the Conservatives thought that was true of some of the things we said about them. I don't think that is enough if you're on the losing side to revisit the legitimacy of a result. It is an endemic feature of elections, and that is the way it goes. And I think it's very dangerous to point to inaccuracies or lies on your opponent's side and say that invalidates an election, when an election itself is a public debate about things, including the veracity of claims. So I personally, much as I think there was a tragedy for our country what happened last Thursday, I don't think that is a wise way for us to go down. I really don't.
I agree that we shouldn't rewind, but how do we prevent this from happening again in the future? Because what we don't want is to get to another point where this can keep continuing to happen.
What's the it? What's the it you're talking about?
These non-truths, if that's what we're going to call them, that we're constantly being fed. You know, it would be great to think that moving forward we can find a way that it's not possible for us to be fed non-truths, and that we can get clearer facts, because what's coming out now is a lot of clearer facts after this has been done, and that's a shame that the public are getting that now and weren't getting it before.
Let's stay with that, because it's obviously, I can see from people in the room, this is something we need to flesh out a little bit. So Stuart, do you want to come, your thoughts on that? So
yeah, I mean,
public life for a long time on sort of in the political trenches on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, look, I mean, let me take two things on this question of lies. Let me take two things which I think are fundamentally wrong about the Leave campaign, but why I don't think they meet that criterion. So I think Tom's wrong about this question of Leave being a settled view, in the sense that I completely agree with him that we shouldn't have Parliament saying we're going to reverse it through an Act of Parliament. I think that's completely right. I certainly don't think we should say, oh, because we lost, we should have a second referendum. I think that argument is not strong enough. I think that's completely right. However, I think what is true is that it's not clear what happens if the next government, after Cameron leaves, tries to engineer a deal and fails. It is not clear what the democratic will expressed in the referendum would say about the situation if a compromise on free movement is not on the table and the price of it is somehow seen by a majority of the people to be not worth it. I think at that point, it's not clear that the referendum still speaks to that situation. And I think that is and just throw this into the pot. Imagine, I think we fundamentally misunderstand our European allies' view of free movement in thinking it's just a commercial issue and we can compromise it. These are countries facing right-wing Eurosceptic, not just incipient, but rising challenges party politically. Why would they reward a country that seeks to blackmail the European Union and walk away? What signal will that send to their very challenges on the far right in their own country and the far left and anti-democratic. But secondly, imagine that they were. Imagine that all 27 countries were prepared to make a historic compromise on the Articles of Faith of the European Union on free movement. Why would they offer it to non-member rather than a member? Why would they incentivize people to leave the European Union to get access to something which would solve huge amounts of political problems of all members of the European Union? If I were them, I'd say, okay, imagine they could somehow climb Everest and get to this point where free movement could be compromised. I'd offer it to members and tell Britain, if you want to have compromise on free movement, you've got to stay. You can't be a Norway. That's much more politically logical. So for all these reasons, I think the strategic logic of it was wrong. I don't think it's helpful to put it in the bucket of lies, because I think that, as I say, that's an endemic feature of campaigns in democracies.
Because you've kind of hoping for this Hotel California.
Well, it's an analytical point as much as a hope. Let me just come in on two things. First, how did it not happen again? One of the mistakes the government made was not to have a full and detailed white paper on the consequences of leaving the European Union. If we'd had evidence, the 350 million was a ludicrous number because it included the rebate. It assumed as soon as we left, the EU would be continuing to give us the rebate, which is bonkers. It clearly wasn't going to happen. But there's all sorts of stuff that is now, the numerous acts of Parliament and legislation is going to have to be looked at again. We should have had a detailed white paper, factual, not an argument, not the Treasury numbers about the economic impact, just a factual thing that we could have gone to say this is the evidence, this is what should have been done. That's one way of dealing with it in the future. Secondly, the immigration issue is something that anybody who was following the debates and following the better reporters knew just how important this was to people. There's lots of ways to deal with it. The tragedy of this is that leave won't make that better. The issues will still be there. And therefore, the problem that we've got is how to address these issues without assuming, as we say, people thought leave meant all the foreigners would leave or something like that. We've got to find much more constructive ways as a country just of addressing those issues. Third point, I agree entirely with Stuart. If you're going to address freedom of movement, which is a big issue throughout the EU, you need to address it. This could be an occasion to do so. So one of the ways in which the terms of the debate start to change, if, let us assume it's Theresa May, our new Prime Minister, whose record on immigration is clearly not on the side of those who want more and more of it, and she's got the credentials on that side at least, goes to have her talk with Chancellor Merkel, and you start to say, well, all right, how do we, as an institution, stop them? There are ways of doing it. These could have been in play beforehand. So I think there are important debates that have to be had on this. The difficulty that we've put ourselves in is that we forced ourselves in a choice where either we have to sacrifice popular concerns about pressure on services and migration or the economy.
I'm going to bring Anne in as well here for this idea of a more flexible Europe then with sort of migration controls, and somehow we, sort of from a legal perspective, how likely that is, and whether you want to comment on any other questions on the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Stuart has said about this. I think one of the things that there's been a failure to appreciate in the UK is the centrality of freedom of movement to the European project. And the idea that there's going to be a compromise on that, I think, is really difficult to see. I also completely agree with what Lawrence said about the consequences of all of this not being worked out. I mean, the very small legal issue that I was focusing on, what is the mechanism for giving the notification, the fact that we don't even have a clear answer to that, and that's a very basic sort of starting point for all of this, is very worrying. Now that my microphone's switched on, I'm going to abuse that fact and just raise one other issue that came up earlier that I didn't get a chance to respond to. So Tom mentioned the European Convention on Human Rights. The European Convention on Human Rights is not a part of EU law. It's a separate legal regime run by the Council of Europe. It is true that all the member states of the EU are signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights, and so remaining within the EU was one of the factors that made it more difficult for the UK to decide to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. But withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights or repealing the Human Rights Act is a totally separate set of legal issues that is not touched on at all by this referendum or by this discussion.
Thank you. Lawrence, there's one question for climate change, but I'm going to open up for some more questions, and then when you get the floor next, if you could field the climate change question. Okay, more questions. I know there's a whole lot of them. Okay, let's take, I haven't said the middle section, so 1, 2, and some men. 3, 4. So I'm going 2 women, 2 men.
Thank you very much for this amazing discussion. Well, my question concerns Scotland. Do you think that the Scottish National Party is likely to hold a referendum deciding whether to break up from the UK, to remain within the UK, or independently to become part of the European Union?
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
So future of Scotland. Yeah. Where's the second one? Yeah, right at the back there, please.
Speaking as someone who has no expertise in government or politics at all, what can the punters in the back row like me do to actually try to make a difference in what happens going forward? And
particular concerns or worries that you feel are particularly important, or what's motivating the question?
Personally, it's for the, well, I'm quite left-wing and a die-hard Remainer as well. So personally, I suppose it's to keep as close of a relationship to Europe as possible and make sure that the poorest aren't hit hardest. But
and it's an important question. I think many of us are now feeling we want to be more active politically than perhaps we've been in the past. They're important issues on the table for us. So a very concrete question about staying closer to Europe then and making sure the poorest aren't hit hardest. Yeah, gentleman with the mic.
I want to return to Stuart's point about the rise of the right wing in Europe. My feeling is that the lesson of the 30s is that the right wing always, fascism rises because of unemployment. And that's a message that does not seem to be getting through to the EU. I find it amazing that the EU is paralyzed and won't change its course, despite the fact that Marine Le Pen could easily be the next president of France, because EU has stuck to its policy of austerity. So I think that the EU is if we want to escape austerity, if we want to stop fascism, if we want to defeat the right, we have to bring something like an FDR New Deal program in the first place to the people of Britain. I think that the people who voted to leave, their economic situation should be foremost in our minds. And that's what we should attend to. And because we have our own currency and are not part of the euro, we have that capacity to do it. We could do it today, and we should take that opportunity.
Great, thank you. And the last question, gentleman with a red shirt at the back there.
Hi. A lesson in history of man is a lesson in migration and a lesson in war. We've been at war, and I believe we're naive to believe that we won't continue to be at war at some point in the future in Europe. And to this, I'm interested in the breakup of Europe, which hasn't been discussed by the panel, and whether the departure of the UK from the EU could precipitate the breakup of the European Union. And on this, I have a moral question. It's been said that to nullify the referendum or hold a new referendum would exacerbate the issue with the disenfranchised has with the political elitism. But I'm wondering, how bad does something have to get before we would accept that the popular majority might be in the wrong?
Meaty question there for us. Great, who'd like to field the Scotland question? So we've got Scotland on the table there. Should we come on this one? You're Scottish as well, Tom, by upbringing as well, if you've got any thoughts on Scotland. But Stuart.
I think the short answer is yes, there's going to be another referendum. Although it depends on two things, I think. It depends on if the next Prime Minister, I personally don't think Article 50 will ever get triggered. That's my personal view. I'm happy to discuss that, another issue. But if the next Prime Minister precipitates clarity that the terms of leave are not acceptable either to that government or to the country, I think that might prompt some kind of revisiting of it all in some way, which I think would then hold off the referendum. I'm not sure that will happen, but I think that's possible. I think the other thing is if the European Union says there's no way for Scotland to join the EU without full exit and reapplication on the usual process, I think that might have a disincentive effect rather than a sort of, Britain leaves but leaves Scotland behind in Europe deal, which I think is what Sturgeon would quite like to do. So I think it's almost certainly it would happen. I was going to answer a couple of others, but I'll leave it.
Do what you got the book.
Just quickly,
Yep.
on your question at the back about, I'll just give you a very practical thing. There is a debate which Compass is running called Pro-Grexit, which is looking at how you make the terms, now we've agreed on leave, how you make it progressive, and I encourage you to look at that, and that's exactly the concern they are looking at, that they're centred on. Your gentleman's question on Europe, I totally agree with. I mean, I'm pro-European who thinks the euro has been a total catastrophe for the European Union. I'm a Germanophile who thinks the Germans are insisting on a regime of austerity and a single currency, which is frankly fracturing the continent. I totally agree with you on that. But, I'm part of a Labour Party that has tried to have failed, but tried now in 2 elections, and will try at the next election, to persuade Britain to have a more fiscally expansive, a more investment-oriented approach to macroeconomic spending at a time when the public doesn't want it. And that's our constraint. For me, the most damaging thing about the euro is the fact of the single currency, but the accompanying macroeconomic regime, which is essentially ruling out budget deficits. I think that's unbelievably economically stupid and hugely damaging to particularly Southern Europe. I totally agree with you on that.
Do you want to come in on the security dimension, sort of the breakup of Europe here, and how bad does it have to get before we ignore the popular?
I think Stuart's answer, in a way, I was trying to allude to it. The good things that Europe has done in terms of our security is potentially put at risk. But I also tried to mention the same point, that the challenges that the risks that the European Union face, and there are risks of other fragmentation, are much greater within the Eurozone core than they are on the outer core, on the outer rim where we are, precisely for these sort of reasons. The strains and pressures that have been put on Greece, on Portugal, on Spain, potentially now on, when it hits Italy and France, it's big news. I mean, because you can't, the mechanisms don't really exist to manage it without a risk of breaking up the Eurozone. So that is a far, far greater existential threat to Europe, threatening enough. It's true that, people tend to talk. One of the irritating things during the debate was as if Juncker talked for the Commission talked for all of Europe. It's the Council of Ministers that are the key ones. But you can see now the Commission wants Britain to leave far more than the Council of Ministers does, because they see us getting in the way of this greater, more Europe project. And so it would be good for us to be out of the way for that. But it's actually, that's where a lot of the damage has taken place, and where the risks are. Now, all that being said, I didn't answer the lady at the back about climate change. The good thing the European Union can do is simply because it's a collection of 28 countries, still a collection of 28 countries, it has clout. If you're in a big international negotiation, people are quite happy to deal with one group. So on climate change, it's had an important role. I don't think we have to become climate change deniers simply because we leave the European Union. Hopefully we don't. We still address the problem. But it is a factor in international organisation that the European Union has had clout. So, my view about all of this is not that the European Union is certain of a bright and confident future in which it carries on doing great things in the way I think it has done in recent history. It's put itself at risk. I don't think we're particularly responsible for the fact that it's put itself at risk, but we have to recognise whatever we do, that risk is still there.
May I just come in on this question of Europe?
Okay.
Because it's so important. So I think one of the really sad things about the debates leading up to the referendum was that both camps were pitching the question in terms of what's in Britain's self-interest. And I'm European too, and I'm delighted to be European. And my vote was as much influenced by what is the good for Europe as what is the good for the UK. And I think actually your language, Stuart, betrays exactly the problem, that there are these articles of faith at the heart of the European project, which has in clear policy statements. I mean, this is not just kind of fantasy conspiracists. The project of a federal Europe at the end of it. And we travelled down the road where cooperation has been the basis for tying European states together. And we've now got to that tipping point where the federalists who believe in the federalist project are wanting to take it further. And European populations are saying no. And you only need to look at the Austrian presidential election to see that result. So my deep hope is that the vote will be a deep wake-up call for people in Brussels who are pushing Europe collectively in a direction which it is far from clear that the people want. And if that recognition occurs, then a lot of the sort of the fire, the anger that's leading to the rise of the far right in some areas, I very much hope the right has a place in domestic politics. It'd be very. I'd be sad if I was excluded. But the rise of the far right, that energy will be taken out of it if precisely that happens. And I think the signals are mixed. So I'm less pessimistic. It seems to me Project Fear has done a great job on the terms of negotiation, and we've seen that in the reporting over the last 7 days. Trade negotiations are, as well as having competitive elements, have cooperative elements, and there's mutual interest in Europe coming to a mutually beneficial arrangement with the UK. And the signals from Merkel are mixed coming out on that, whether it's hardball or whether it's mutual interest.
Everyone's trying to feel their way at the moment and figure out what their positions will be. And can I bring you in, because you've worked extensively as well on EU employment law. Do you see flexibility being built into the EU to respond to some of these cleavages? Or do you see the sort of project federal Europe just going ahead full speed?
I think from my perspective, I mean, to go back to the question about the breakup of Europe, I think a major contributing factor is that Europe has failed, or governments have failed, to make clear to ordinary working people whether and to what extent they benefit from membership of the EU. The original thinking was that the EU didn't need to intervene in employment law matters at all, because everyone would just get better and better off, and the pie would get bigger and we'd all get a bigger slice of the pie. Over time, there's been a greater attempt to protect workers' rights through EU law, but as soon as we got into austerity measures, workers' rights began to be questioned, and a much more sort of neoliberal vein of thinking began to reappear. And to the extent that there's a focus on job creation, it's a focus on creating jobs that are not of particularly good quality and don't have much permanence attached to them, don't have many rights attached to them. So I think there's a real issue about how Europe relates to ordinary citizens and how ordinary citizens experience the benefits that Europe was supposed to bring and may or may not have in fact brought.
So in a way it faces the similar questions as we face here in the UK. I'm going to open up, I'm going to take 3 questions because time is now short. Okay, the first 3 hands get it. 1, 2, 3. You're first off the bat. Yep, gentleman on the floor here.
Hi there. I've got a question which has been plaguing me since last Friday. I spent 18 hours in tears after hearing the result. You've been discussing, and I wrote to my MP, Nick Blackwood, on Tuesday, again, in tears. It was like losing a relative. That's the only thing I can compare it to. So to the Leave people, it's a little bit stronger than you think. So the question is top-down. You've been talking top-down. My question is bottom-up. The UK is intending to leave the EU. What about citizens, including myself, seriously looking at intending to leave the United Kingdom? I am seriously looking at disenfranchising myself. Apparently there's no legal way of doing that, but I'll find a way. I'll leave. I don't intend to stay if the European Union is not part of the United Kingdom.
You obviously feel this very personally, on a very personal level. You've shared that
so
with us,
this is directed.
The question,
So the point being, what are you going to do with a massive part of the population, especially the young population, feeling disconnected, feeling like they're not having a future, and wanting to leave like me.
Great. Well, not great in that case, but thank you for the question. Right. Sorry, I've forgotten who I pointed out as the second lady in the red shirt. Is that right? And then the person at the back there with the black shirt on.
Thank you very much. I just have a question that I think is on all of our minds, which is we want to leave from here at least having a little bit more clarity what can potentially happen in the next 2 years. And my question is that it seems to me that everyone pretty much keeps saying we have to respect the vote, the people have spoken, we have to respect what the people have said. However, as John Oliver said, there are no do-overs of referenda, and this is different than general elections when, in 4 years' time you can change your mind and you can vote against the party. This is meant to be forever. And I thought that there was the same question as with Scotland. However, the structural situation for Scotland has changed, and now there's a new referendum on the table again. So my question to you is that although we keep hearing from Theresa May and everyone all the time that we have to respect the vote and there's definitely no second referendum on the table, I would like to hear from you what are the potential scenarios for a second referendum.
Thank you. And then person at the back in the black shirt.
I would like to address one of the questions that was brought up very briefly, but I think it's fundamental, it's very structural in UK politics. And it's the fact that misinformation, as we all know, was ranging in both campaigns during this referendum. And there isn't an organism in the UK that could regulate that and make sure that there's a fact check. And because there are some people in the UK that do not have any other sources of information. So they will have ill-informed votes if they do not have, if the government doesn't provide for that, the right and the veracity of the information that is on the question. And then I would like to focus this on populist ideologies, because I come from Venezuela, and it's a country that has benefited, or let's say the governing party has benefited from misinformation in campaigns. And if we allow this in a country such as Britain, in politics, where are our decisions going to be going? Because such a referendum taking a big, important issue cannot be led by ill-informed decisions. So I would like to know your opinion on an organism that would regulate this.
Sounds like a push back to you, Stuart, on this kind of idea that there's always misinformation and mudslinging. But I'm going to give you the word in a minute.
Really strong.
I'm going to start with Anne.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Sorry. So, Anne, do you want to come back on this question, particularly on the referendum elections, perhaps from a legal perspective?
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
I suppose I sort of slightly touched on this earlier. I think it's important not to argue immediately for a second referendum along the lines that Tom said, you've got the wrong answer, please have another go. But I think that there might be a case for that in the situation in which there is some sort of deal on the table that could be put to the electorate for their approval. That would be a change in circumstances where I think there might be an arguable case that it would be legitimate to have another referendum. I think just in relation to the disconnection point, and I now speak not as a lawyer at all, but just generally, please organise, please participate in the political process. It's the only option we've got, really.
Thank you. Let's work our way around, Tom.
So just very quickly, on the third one, as it happens, Britain is in a fantastic position because we have this organisation called the BBC, which is a publicly funded organisation where it's got a publicly mandated business model, licence fee. 84% of UK citizens get their news from the BBC. So actually the question in my mind is the dangerous monopoly that the BBC has on the news rather than the lack of information.
But this idea, Tom, that we should have some kind of sort of government should play a role, or we should have some kind of government body that sort of authorises facts and sort of issues facts. We've got a clearer basis for making information.
Yeah, I suppose I have to think about that harder. So there's the Organisation for Budgetary Responsibility, National Statistics Office, Electoral Commission.
Yeah.
So
none of those bodies overlook leaflets or campaign material. I believe there used to be a regulatory body up until '97, but currently there is no regulatory body that overlooks campaign facts.
That's an interesting fact. Thank you for bringing that to the table. Perhaps food for thought as we all move forward in this debate whether we should have and reinstitute
Can I
such
just
an organisation.
come very quickly
Yes,
back
that's what I was
to
going to ask
So
you to
it's a very
respond to.
impassioned contribution. Thank you very much for that. And I'm very sorry that well, I'm not sorry that you feel it so deeply, because this is a deep issue that is of deep concern for us.
It's existential, like you say.
Right, so I suppose it's existential in terms of the country's constitutional future. I very much hope that it's possible to share a country with someone who has a dispute about whether the fundamental organ of decision-making should be in Brussels in relation to the UK, or whether it should be Westminster. I mean, that seems to me the kind of discussion. Sorry, I don't know whether it's a lens or a pistol.
He's shooting you in the only acceptable sense.
So I very much don't mean this as a disparagement, but it's if you couldn't go for a beer with me afterwards because we had different views on this, I would be very sorry about that. And I don't think that compromises my freedom to hold that particular view. Yeah. I'd love to.
Good invitation for where we'll be headed after.
Between me and you and the pub. So a couple of things. First, as a number of people have pointed out, the anger a lot of people in this room feel is probably the anger the people who just voted Leave felt time and time again, as they felt disregarded, lacking expression, nobody taking much notice of them. So maybe, it doesn't do us any harm to feel what it's like on the other way. Secondly, I'm old enough to remember 1976 and having to go to the IMF. I'm old enough to remember the 3-day week. This country's been through tough times before, and it's a great country. The EU is an important part of our lives. It's going to change. Maybe it won't change as much as people think, but there's an awful lot of good things going on, and it'd be an awful shame if we got ourselves into sort of complete gloom and doom and not try to make things work in a new situation. Third, on referendums. When at the start of all of this, there was a great debate about what Mrs. Thatcher would have voted if she was still around. What people forget is she hated referendums. She thought they were an instrument of fascism. And one of the things that she liked least about Europe was the fact that they kept on having these plebiscites. And she was quite right in many ways. We're a parliamentary democracy, a representative democracy. And now we've brought referendums in, it becomes impossible to take a big decision without one, rather than, in the end, these are things that the government decides, and then we have an election every few years in which we can decide whether they've got it right or not. Now, it is true when you're making a fundamental constitutional change, even in 1975, we thought, you really can't do it without checking with the people whether it's okay. So that's there. But it is a problem. Mitterrand once said, the trouble with referendums is you put a question and people answer a different one. And that's one of the difficulties we've got. Well, we have another one. I think we could, or we can have a government go into the country on a deal or not a deal, saying we've taken this as far as we can. I think I genuinely think, I think we're in agreement that it's going to be very hard for the government to trigger Article 50 unless they're very sure about where it's going to lead. And the choices that poses are just awful. It's easier in some way not to make the choice than to have to make the choice between the economy and freedom of movement. But it's a difficult one, just to delay it and delay it and delay it. So at some point, we're going to have some form of clarity. Otherwise, it's sort of like a frozen conflict in Eastern Europe. We're going to have some sort of clarity. But it doesn't have to be another referendum. It could be a government going to the country and saying, this is where we are, back us now on what's been done. I'd actually prefer that than just ingrain this idea that every time there's a big decision, we have to put it to a national vote in this way.
Stuart, your thoughts on these last questions, and I think there was one earlier that we didn't touch upon, which was the future of political parties.
Yeah, I've been dodging that one, yeah. Okay, because very quickly, don't want to take up too much of your time. On this lady's question about plausible scenario, I think there are 4 plausible scenarios. One is, who knows, like the prediction business in politics at the moment is not a good business to be in. But the first is that the new Tory government will try and engineer outside of Article 50 a kind of shimmy from the EU to the EEA and say, right, let's just forget the Article 50 nonsense in the treaty. Let's just say we're in the EEA and we'll start bargaining EEA minus or plus from there. That's the first thing. That's what I think a lot of them want to do. The second is that they trigger Article 50, maybe after developing a negotiating plan. I think that for Lawrence has said, I think that would be self-destructive sort of thing to do because all the bargaining chips are on the side of your opponents. That commits us to leaving no matter what the terms, and I think that is not something that even a Prime Minister, even committed to the Leave cause, want to do. The third thing is this is sort of limbo. It just keeps going on. And at some point a deal is proposed, and as Lawrence said, the government goes to the public with it in some form and says, back us. If the public says no, then it's not clear what happens after that. And then the fourth scenario is one in which, one I said earlier, where Labour, the Lib Dems and others say, okay, we respect the referendum, but circumstances have changed, the economic hit's bigger than we thought, there's buyer's remorse and this, that and the other. So the next election we want to be, if you vote for a Labour government the next election, it is a vote to go back in the European Union. And Labour is split about, at the moment, about whether that's the right thing to do. You can see the dilemmas it has there, right? So those are my four scenarios. To the gentleman at the back about an independent state institute for vetting information. You can see from the way I've described your option that I don't like it. Look, I worked for Gordon Brown in 2010. We had 2 shitty years after the economic crash. And in that election, David Cameron and his team portrayed the crash as Labour's fault for overspending. In my view, that is factually untrue. I don't even think it's a matter of interpretation, right? That's just me. You can disagree, right? I think it's factually untrue. Are you saying that David Cameron should be stopped from making that argument by an independent state commission? I think that way lies a kind of politics that we really, really don't want to embrace.
I don't think that was the suggestion.
Well, but
the suggestion is to then check whether the fact was...
Well, so I would run the fact check on that and say it's untrue. The IMF says it's untrue.
That was the request.
Does that mean that we then stop him saying it? I think that, I'm a John Stuart Mill fan on this front. I mean, I think what you have to do is you have to be robust and say that's a lie, and you should use the exposure of the lie against your opponent. But I don't think it's the job of the state to say that you can't say that. And by the way, if they had done it in this campaign, they probably would have said to George Osborne, your 4,300 figure about how much households are going to lose, that's made up. You can't use it. So, I agree with other Remainers in the room that the sort of toxicity of the misspeaking on one side was greater than the other. That's just my personal view. But I really think you're opening the door to things that I think we can't tolerate. We have to, whether we like it or not, have more faith in the kind of rigorous light that we all shine on each other's arguments during campaigns. I think that's the only way we have to go, imperfect as it may be. And the question of party breakup, very quickly, I think the Tories aren't going to break up at all. I think the Tories are going to go into the next phase. I think they'll be more right-wing and they'll be more Eurosceptic. And my great fear as someone on the left is that there is an obvious avenue for them to go down, which is to say now that we're going to leave Europe, we should be cutting taxes more, deregulating more, and sort of race to the bottom, and I really don't like that view. That's a partisan view, but I think there's a coherence to the Tory future. I think Labour is in a much more existential crisis. Actually, weirdly, it's not about Europe. It's not going to split along pro-European, anti-European lines. Europe has been the trigger for a crisis, but it's not the fundamental cleavage underlying the split. The split's about something else, which is actually to do with whether you conceive of the Labour Party as a movement or as a candidate to take power in Westminster. That's really the fundamental fight going on there. It's perfectly possible that we'll split, I fear. I hope it doesn't, obviously.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to leave you just with a couple of thoughts. One is I think we've started a conversation here. It's revealed quite how profound the issues are that are on the table for us in the next months and weeks ahead. And I wanted just to leave that phrase that Jo Cox said in her maiden speech to Parliament, which is that there's more that unites us than divides us. And I think that's really important for us to remember now. And she was always someone who reached out to the other side and sought to understand, even though she had very passionate views herself. So I think for all of us, that's incumbent on us to rebuild our democracy by reaching out and by understanding those who might have voted differently and held different views. But thank you. This has been a phenomenal session. I think you'll all agree. And let's thank all the speakers on the panel.